What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen, and I am back with another true crime video for you guys. Today, we're going to be speaking about the abduction of 8-year-old Relisha Rudd from Washington, D.C. back in 2014. And there's already quite a bit of coverage on this case out there. It's one that's very well known, which typically I try to stick to lesser known cases to help raise awareness, but I could not pass up, and we all know this, I could not pass up a moment of education and raising awareness on certain things that I feel like a lot of us can very easily kind of turn a blind eye to. Just situations that could actually be happening around us. And this is just a prime example of one of those situations. This case makes me a little bit crazy. I'm just going to be quite frank with you. And I feel like anyone who knows the details will understand why. The details are very confusing. They're very contradictory. There's so much that is unknown because somehow, some way, it took well over 2 weeks for anyone to realize that this 8-year-old girl was missing. And because that valuable time was lost, this whole case was just pure chaos. And she's still not been found to this day. And while it is known, and this I feel like is so rare, it is known who is responsible for this young girl's abduction. It was actually found very quickly. No one knows where she is, and that's just absolutely wild to me. So hopefully raising awareness can help solicit tips, and also I really want to shed a light on the realities and vulnerabilities of homelessness, especially homeless children. And because homelessness is everywhere, it's not just in places like Washington, D.C., I feel like this could be something that as a community we can maybe try to help out with or try to understand better. There's just something to learn here, so I had to take a moment to speak about this case. Before I tell you all of the confusing details of this case, and again, just like last week, we're going to be here for a while, grab a snack, I need to first thank Harry's for partnering with me on today's video. Now, you guys already know that I love and support Harry's for so many different reasons. Harry's beautifully designed razors help me reduce my own waste on a daily basis, which is something that I am a huge advocate for, but I also get a pretty dang fabulous shave at the same time. And not to brag or anything, but I may or may not have an inflatable pool and a 3-lane slip and slide in my backyard, so I need to make sure I have a nice clean shave. Harry's has a two-tone razor handle, and it's made from 50% recycled plastic, which is like a huge plus in my book. It's easy to grip, so it's not constantly slipping out of your hands while you're trying to shave. It has a great weight to it, feeling super luxurious, and the best part about it is that it is reusable. No more throwing away entire razors after every few uses, which just feels incredibly wasteful. Instead, all you have to do is pop in a new high-quality blade and keep things moving. And the best part to me is that blade refills can come straight to your door, so it's not something you have to continuously be thinking about. The blades themselves have a precision trimmer, which is my husband's favorite when it comes to shaving right around his neckline. There's also a flex hinge on it to make sure you have the most comfortable shave possible, because let me tell you, cutting your knees is not a very fun experience. And when paired with my all-time favorite, like I have raved about this at this point for years, their foaming shave gel, your skin is left so smooth. It's not irritated in the slightest. I have very sensitive skin, but this shave gel, hands down, has changed my life. The formula in the shave gel uses things like aloe, there's hyaluronic acid, it's super moisturizing. My skin absolutely loves it. Plus, the razors are fair price. They are for absolutely everyone. There is no pink tax. Moment of applause for that. And the absolute way to my heart, Harry's gives 1% of their global sales to nonprofit organizations. Seriously, if you think about it, and I know I harp on this all the time, we have so many things that we do in our daily lives. And if you're someone that already buys razors regularly, why not go ahead and make the switch to an option that's, first of all, better for the planet because there's a lot less waste. Also, support a company that gives back to those in need. Small changes honestly really do add up. In the starter set, you get a 5-blade razor, the weighted handle, a blade cover, and the foaming shave gel. And right now, you can redeem your starter set for just $3 when you go to harrys.com/Danielle. You guys will absolutely love it, and you'll be making quite a positive impact on the planet at the same time. Thank you again to Harry's for partnering with me on today's video and allowing me to do what I do and give back to these families the best way that I possibly can. And now on to the details of today's case. So let's go ahead and start with Relisha. As I said, this information's incredibly confusing. Everything jumps all over the place. It's really difficult to follow, so I'm going to try my absolute hardest to make it make sense. I've spent so much time trying to arrange things and information in a way that it's easily digestible for you guys. Relisha was 8 years old when she was abducted sometime in February into March 2014. The dates are honestly all over the place. So the very last time, and what is on most of the information online, things along those lines on the missing persons poster, it labels March 1st as being the very last time Relisha was seen. And I will get into the details of that in a little while. But she was seen on surveillance footage February 26, 2014. But she wasn't even reported as missing until March 19th, 2014. So like I said, it's difficult to make sense of things when there's just weeks of missing timeline. And before you can really understand how exactly this came to be to begin with, you really need to understand Relisha's history, her family, even before she was born. So that's what I'm going to dive into now. Relisha was the firstborn of Shamika Young, her mother, just a year and a half after Shamika aged out of the foster care system. And unfortunately, things like drug use, foster care, homelessness was a pattern in Relisha's family even before she was born as well, and ended up being a pattern in her own life. Shamika, Relisha's mother, along with her 4 siblings, were taken away from their mother, Relisha's grandmother, Melissa, when they were relatively young. Shamika specifically was only 9 years old at the time. From what I've seen, Melissa struggled with drugs amongst a handful of other things, and that's why they all ended up in the foster care system. But being in foster care is quite a challenge on so many different levels. And I'm well aware that there are so many positive stories that do come out of foster care. But unfortunately, especially being in the genre of true crime, usually when I've encountered stories in terms of foster care, they're just not positive ones. Shamika herself, Relisha's mom, seemed to really struggle a lot for obvious reasons. When you are going through a life change like that, where first and foremost your mother figure was not really the best mother figure, you were exposed to a lot of drug use at a young age, your life is just chaos, and then you're uprooted from those things that, despite them not being the best environment, it's the only environment you know, and then you're thrown into foster care. It is a challenge. So she ended up developing a lot of struggles mentally. From different articles that I have seen, she struggled a lot with threatening self-harm and harming others. She was just really going through it. And on top of that, there were a lot of other behavioral issues while she was in foster care. So unfortunately, she became one of the cases where Shamika bounced from foster home to foster home, back and forth like a ping pong ball. And eventually she ended up being put into a mental health crisis center for youth. Now, unfortunately, through all of this struggle and all of these years, none of Melissa's children were ever reunited with her, which is usually the main goal when it comes to foster care, is to reunite the children with their parents. And this was just not the case with Shamika and all of her siblings. So when Shamika finally aged out of the foster care system, she met a man named Irving Rudd. He was 16 years older than her at the time. I have absolutely no idea how they met, but he came into her life dragging quite the massive criminal history behind him. So in 1992, this man, Irving Rudd, who is Relisha Rudd's biological father, he had been convicted of murdering his own 17-month-old daughter. I'm not going to get into the details because it's honestly just absolutely heartbreaking and I cannot bear to speak about it. He was in fact convicted of it and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. I'm not sure how far prior to the murder of his daughter, but at some point prior to that, there were also accusations that he had also murdered his young son. From what I have seen, Police have stated they believe that's exactly what happened, but something to do with a plea deal and the murder of his daughter ended up making it so that they could not charge him for the murder of his son as well. Along came Shamika and Irving Rudd's first child, Relisha Rudd. And shortly after this, they had their second child, a son. But it seems that after this second child, this little boy, things went awry, and for some reason, Irving and Shamika were no longer together, and it seemed as if Shamika was now just a single mother. It does not appear that Irving remained in the picture. I do know that years and years later, I think he did attempt to get 2 of his children back or something along those lines. Clearly, that did not work out, but it does seem like Shamika was, from this point on, doing everything on her own. Shamika and her 2 children, including Relisha, bounced around from house to house, just like she had in foster system. And then eventually Shamika ended up meeting a young man named Antonio Wheeler, who would eventually go on to be her fiance. And they seemed to hit it off right off the bat. Antonio was either one of 9 children or he had 9 siblings. And he also had bounced around all through foster care most of his childhood. They just seemed to have a lot in common and they got along really well. So during their relationship, they ended up having 2 boys of their own, which brought the total to Shamika, Antonio, and their 4 children, which again included Relisha. Now, from their own accounts, despite struggling, they were a very happy family. Antonio spoke very highly of their cereal nights that they would have together, and special times where they would all play, taking the kids to the playground. But unfortunately, those same cycles and struggles that both Antonio and Shamika had dealt with through their entire childhood ended up following them into their adulthood as well. And these cycles are absolutely no joke. And I feel like there's just not enough education on how difficult it is to break them. I feel like there's so many people out there that say, you be the one to break the cycle. There's all these people that are saying you have the opportunity to make a change, to not be like your parents, or to not do this, that, and the other. And I'm just going to say it right here. I think that's a very privileged way of thinking. When you're talking about individuals that have gone through a lot of the things that Shamika and Antonio did, I speak a lot about this when I talk about the Indigenous population, residential schooling, all of those things happening in Canada. It's not as easy as just saying, oh, I'm going to be the one to break the cycle. When you don't have proper access to things like mental health care or, all of these different things that it requires to break that cycle, you don't have a strong support system. It's not that easy. And unfortunately, this is likely why they landed right back in the same positions. Now, from records that I have seen, there were at least 3 instances where Shamika and her family ended up being evicted from their homes due to non-payment. They did end up staying with Shamika's sister Ashley for a while. Ashley had also struggled with homelessness once she aged out of foster care. She actually ended up in DC General, which is where Relisha and her family ultimately ended up before her abduction and disappearance. Ashley was able to get her own home eventually. She was able to get up on her own 2 feet. But unfortunately, this arrangement just didn't work out because after a while, Ashley's landlord was like, you cannot have this many people, 4 kids and 2 extra adults in your home. So they had to be kicked out of here as well. And at this point, we're talking the middle of the winter in Washington, D.C. It's incredibly cold. They had 4 children they had to take care of. So they began to call shelters. That was the only option that they had at this point. Like I just mentioned in one of my videos, I think it was like 2 videos ago, it's fairly common for hotels to be used as like this halfway waiting point when families cannot immediately be placed into some sort of shelter. Either shelters, are waiting for a bed to open, or there's just a plethora of different reasons why this can happen. And that's exactly what happened to Relisha and her family. They were put into a hotel that was supposed to be a temporary situation and ended up being there for an entire year. 6 individuals and a single hotel room for an entire year. But eventually, they did manage to get their own space at DC General. DC General had actually operated as a hospital from 1806 to 2001 before being shut down. And because the population of Washington, D.C., there was just a massive homeless population. They were having a lot of issues placing all of these different homeless families and individuals into safe spaces. So they decided to transform DC General to a homeless shelter. And I use the word transform very loosely. DC General has an awful reputation, a very, very bad one. Ashley, Relisha's aunt and Shamika's sister, had been living there right after aging out of foster care. And I feel like this kind of sums DC General up entirely. Ashley ended up deciding that being on the streets was a better option than staying at DC General. According to interviews with those that have stayed in DC General, for many it felt like a prison. They fully searched you, patted you down before you could enter, which, at first you're thinking, okay, this is a very safe situation. They're just trying to make sure that nobody with bad intentions or weapons or who knows what comes into this homeless shelter. There's this guise of it being a safe place, but on the inside, once you pass that security, that's not at all what it's like. DC General was known for numerous fights breaking out with children right there, possibly getting in the way, possibly being injured. There was a lot of theft. There was a lot of drug use. A lot of residents that honestly had no other option but to stay there didn't feel safe, but there was just nowhere else to go. There were not many efforts at all as well to totally erase the fact that DC General was no longer a hospital. So I'm pretty sure you can already see where this is heading. First and foremost, there apparently were rooms just filled with medical equipment and not just that, but old patient records. And all of these things were just tucked in rooms that, according to residents, were unlocked. So, anyone staying here could stumble into a room and read a patient's files or somehow get their hands on medical equipment. They also never made it a point to take down a lot of the hospital signs. So all of the signage that's like ER, take this exit or whatever, that was all still remaining up. And so people who weren't fully aware that DC General had been changed to a homeless shelter, maybe people who were just visiting or things along those lines, would show up to this now homeless shelter believing it was still a hospital. And I'm talking instances where people would drop someone off severely injured, just pouring blood, and they'd be in what they believed is a waiting room, when in reality there's families, children around them, petrified, watching this person just bleeding from a gunshot wound or who knows what, standing in the middle of this lobby. According to residents, there were also no safe places really for children to play. I have seen in some photos that there were a few rooms that looked like kids could go there and color and do things like that, but there was not a playground outside. A lot of children resorted to just playing in the parking lot, and unfortunately across from the parking lot was a jail, and there was also a bus stop that was known for people just hanging out there doing drugs. Things were always broken pipes, toilets weren't working, there were rat infestations. People reported having raccoons. You heard me right, raccoons in their bathrooms and just their rooms in general. There were bed bug infestations. I mean, anything you can possibly think of, it usually happened or was just an ongoing problem at DC General. And all of these different residents complained about the level of filth, the drug, and the criminal activity. And unfortunately, it just seems like there was not too much being done about it. When you browse through the reviews of DC General on Google, you can read all of this for yourself from individuals that have said they've lived there, and I found it super frustrating because the more positive reviews that were there, the 5-star reviews, oh, this place is great, you can see that it's mainly from people who are not homeless, and they essentially would do this 5-star review and then use it as an opportunity to say you should be thankful that you even have a roof over your head. Totally forget the fact that this is being run by Health and Human Services. This should be a safe, sanitary living situation, And it was like, forget that. These people think you should just deal with the fact that there's roaches and sicknesses and toilets not working because you at least have a roof over your head. It was just really, really kind of disappointing to read through all of those different reviews. But this was the kind of living situation that Relisha and her family were now being moved into. There was one room per family. They would kind of roll as many beds as they could into these rooms. There usually was only a toilet and a sink in the rooms, and then communal bathrooms, which, as you can imagine, was incredibly difficult for families with young children. But this is exactly why Relisha ultimately ended up referring to the shelter as the trap house. That is how she referred to it whenever she spoke about it. Now, once she moved to DC General, she also had to move schools. She ended up at Payne Elementary School, which is about half a mile away from the shelter, so it's not far at all. And according to everyone there, she loved school. She had the time of her life in school. I feel like it was a place where she felt safe. She felt she could be herself. She didn't have to worry about anything. Is she going to get lunch? Is she going to be able to use a proper bathroom? Things along those lines. And everyone that knew Relisha said she just made this unforgettable impression on them. Despite all of these challenges that she had been dealing with, she was bubbly, she was kind-hearted, she was the life of the party, she was always being funny and dancing and having a good time, but obviously her teachers still did have concerns. According to Relisha's teachers, she would show up usually dirty to school in the morning. Her clothes would be dirty. Her hair would be dirty. She would be complaining about being hungry a lot of the time. And a lot of the same things were seen through the Homeless Children's Playtime Project. This is a nonprofit that's run by a woman named Jamila Larson. It basically provides a few hours of safe and fun play a week for children in DC that are homeless. It seems like the goal, just kind of across the board, was to keep these young children out of the homeless shelter as much as possible, probably because so many people knew the realities of what it was like in the shelter. And so the Playtime Project was just an absolute godsend for so many of these kids. But while at school and while at Project Playtime, Relisha would constantly try to find ways to stay longer. Like, after everyone else had gone home, she wanted to be able to stay a little bit longer. She made it a point to try to not go back to the shelter. So again, that gives you a glimpse into how Relisha likely felt about having to live there. They would keep spare clothing for her, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. I love people that just take the initiative to help in whatever way that they can. So they would make sure to get Relisha into clean clothes when she would show up to school or to the Playtime Project. They would do kind of like bird baths for her in the bathroom to try to clean up her face and her hair a little bit. It was also reported by a handful of sources that Relisha would fake illnesses to be able to go and stay with family members instead of at the shelter. I've seen that Relisha struggled with asthma. I've also seen it stated that she had always struggled from really bad headaches or migraines. I've even seen it said that she had a seizure at some point, and I'm not sure what exactly the medical issues are, or if they're even real or, anything like that. I don't know if she was just totally making things up to try to get away from the shelter. But despite all of these things, she continued to hang on tight to her love for life. And unfortunately, in the end, she was failed by so many that were supposed to protect her. And this is where things get very confusing. So you're gonna have to hang in here with me. And as always, my video is not an end-all be-all. If you don't understand something or you want to know more about something, there's so much information out there. I encourage you guys to do your own research, but this is the best way I could compile things together. So Relisha had quite a handful of unexcused absences from Payne Elementary in 2013 and 2014. And since there was such a large population of homeless children attending the school, because it was the closest one to DC General, they had a lot of different social workers there and liaisons to attempt to keep tabs on all of these different children properly. So on February 25th, 2014, Relisha had her 5th unexcused absence from school. Now, I don't know if this was consecutive. I've not been able to clear that up in any of my research, and I've tried very dang hard to do that. But I have seen it stated that while this was her 5th unexcused absence, she had in total actually missed around 30 days around this time. Again, I don't know if that's consecutive, but moving on. Either way, when something like this happens, especially when the family or the child is working with child protective services, things along those lines, there are certain days that kind of come up where a red flag has to be raised. And 5 is one of those. So at this point, the school reached out to Shamika, her mother, to schedule a meeting for March 5th to discuss these absences and try to figure out some sort of solution. So March 5th came around. From my understanding, Relisha still hadn't been to school in this time frame. So Shamika was informed about all of the different support services that were available to both her and Relisha to make sure that she made it to school, because after a certain period of time, it's considered educational neglect, and that's not something that anyone wants to happen. And at this point, I've seen it stated in a review that was done of the case that was requested by the mayor. Again, I'll get deeper into that in a little bit. But in this review, it states that Shamika proceeded to inform DC public school staff that Relisha was actually very sick at the time, that these weren't just unexcused absences, but she was struggling a lot, she was not well, and she was under the care of a Dr. Tatum. And this is why she had not been in school. According to interviews done with the social worker has stated that a handful of different notes had in fact been either sent into the school or, hand given to the school around this time to explain all of Relisha's absences. The social worker even specifically stated that it wasn't just Shamika that was involved in sending these notes, but that Relisha's grandmother had actually been one of the ones to send these notes in as well. And one of these notes around this time included the number for this Dr. Tatum, so that the school could get in contact with Dr. Tatum to basically prove that Relisha was under his care at the time, was unable to come to school, and basically the situation could be solved. So 5 days later, on March 10th, this Dr. Tatum ended up speaking on the phone with a social worker at the school, and Dr. Tatum confirmed that Relisha was in fact struggling with some neurological issues. He brought up the fact that she had had these headaches, and that she was in fact under his care. She was receiving treatment, but he also stated that Relisha would be discharged the following week by the end of the week, and at that point she should be able to come back to school. It seemed legitimate-ish. I say that loosely as well. And he allegedly asked the social worker for very specific dates that were these unexcused absences so that he could write up the proper documentation and notes to resolve the situation. According to the social worker, they had more than just one phone call with Dr. Tatum. There were a handful of them over the course of a week, but this documentation, these doctor's notes from Dr. Tatum, ultimately never ended up coming in. So on March 13th, CFSA became involved because Relisha had hit the magic number of 10 unexcused absences, which at that point, again, is considered educational neglect. Now, according to the review that I just mentioned that was done, the school should have alerted CFSA much earlier than this. It had actually already been past the 10 days of unexcused absences, but according to the school, they wanted to extend the time to give Shamika a chance to get in this proper documentation. But after a while, enough was enough, so it was reported anyways. But despite the school being given this very strict 2-day time frame, when CFSA was eventually alerted, they by absolutely no means immediately jumped into action. It took until March 19th, okay? And they were alerted on the 13th. It took until March 19th for anyone to get any sort of answers, and I don't even think it was CFSA that got them. It was the social worker with the school. So at this point, the notes from Dr. Tatum were still not in. And keep in mind, the original conversation was had on March 5th, spoke to the doctor on March 10th. It's now March 19th. These notes should have been in. So obviously something needed to be done. I have seen multiple different renditions of how exactly this played out. So I'm just going to tell you all of the different ways that I've seen it because I am not sure which one is correct. I've seen that the social worker just decided to go on their own accord to the shelter and ask around about Dr. Tatum and these notes. I've also seen that they were told by the principal or someone along those lines to go to the doctor himself to get the notes, but they didn't have any information about this doctor other than his name and this phone number. They didn't know where the practice was, anything along those lines. So the social worker went to DC General to try to find questions. I've also seen that there was even an arrangement that they had made with Dr. Tatum to specifically go and get these documents that he said he had left on the 19th. So they were just going to pick them up like planned. But regardless, for whichever one of these reasons, somehow, some way, the social worker did in fact end up at DC General to get some sort of answers. And this social worker began to ask around about Dr. Tatum and, try to figure out who this Dr. Tatum was. Sometimes in situations like this, these doctors actually practice within the shelter, but no one at the shelter claimed to know a Dr. Tatum. But they did know a Khalil Tatum, and Khalil Tatum was a janitor working at DC General. And according to those that knew Relisha Rudd, they said that Relisha and Khalil Tatum had a very unusually close relationship. It became pretty dang clear at this point, honestly, a little bit too late, but it became clear at this point that DCPS and CFSA had basically been run around in circles. So right away, police were informed of what was going on and the fact that Relisha Rudd had not been in school since at least the 25th of February, and it's now March 19th, and not a single person knows where she actually is. And the excuse that had been given that she was with a Dr. Tatum was not true because this doctor was not a doctor but a janitor. Right away, as you can imagine, police arrived to DC General to figure out what on earth is actually going on. So they bring in Shamika as well as Antonio to speak to them within DC General to see what they have to say. Now, this again is where there is a lot of contradictory information and a lot of disagreement. So according to what police have directly stated, and you can find this on multiple sources, it's actually in the review itself, which is a legal document. Shamika told police that she had dropped Relisha off to stay with Khalil Tatum, that she was aware that Relisha was with Khalil, and from what it seems, she was even still referring to him as Dr. Tatum, despite him not being a doctor. Now, this next part, the only place I've been able to find this piece of information is from the Charlie Project, which usually is a very reputable source, so I did want to add it in here, but I just want to let you know I have not been able to confirm it. But according to the Charlie Project, they released that Shamika explained that Relisha had been given to Khalil Tatum on February 25th, so the day of her 5th unexcused absence, and Shamika allegedly claimed that Dr. Tatum took Relisha to a medical conference in Atlanta, Georgia. She said that they left on March 8th and that she wasn't sure when they'd be back, but that she did speak to Relisha on the 17th. Now, again, I cannot confirm that. When it comes to what Antonio had to say, he claimed that he had absolutely no idea that Relisha had been missing. Now, according to him, he was out of town a lot for work, and he said that he had been out of town recently, so this was pretty much total news to him. But he's also claimed in interviews throughout the years that he had spoken to the liaison from Payne Elementary immediately prior to this, pretty much, like within days of police being alerted to Relisha's disappearance. And he said that he was picking up the boys, and the liaison came up to him and mentioned the fact that Relisha would be discharged soon and that they were happy that she'd finally be able to come back to school. And according to him, this was the first time that he had learned she hadn't been going to school, that, she had been absent. So I don't know what he thought she was doing during this time. He was clearly going to pick up the boys. So did he just think she was somewhere else? Honestly, I have no idea. I don't really think anyone does. It just seems like no one either wants to say what was going on during this time, or everyone genuinely just had absolutely no idea even if they were supposed to be the ones responsible for Relisha at the time. Antonio has also claimed that in the middle of speaking with authorities, he was super stressed out and asked to have a smoke break. And so he was escorted by a police officer outside to take the smoke break. Now, he claimed while he's there, and we're talking about on the 19th of March, when the police are figuring out about this Dr. Tatum and the fact that he's not a doctor but a janitor, the whole 9 yards, they're questioning the family, trying to figure out where this Dr. Tatum lives, trying to figure out where Relisha is. Antonio claims that he saw Khalil Tatum at DC General while he was outside smoking a cigarette, that Khalil was there working, pushing his cart as normal, and he claims that he confronted Khalil and said, "Where is my daughter? You know, what's going on? I'm being told that she's missing." And he said that Khalil stated that Relisha was safe at home with his wife, Andrea, and that he said, quote, "I'm not trying to keep your daughter." While this definitely seems like a very odd thing to say, and he has said this is something that he will never forget, ever, I also find it very odd that he was allegedly escorted out by police and they were quite literally looking for this man, looking for Khalil Tatum to figure out where Relisha was. And somehow there was a whole conversation with Khalil Tatum while this officer was watching Antonio and nothing was ever done. Honestly, I am just confused by that whole situation. I don't know if maybe the officer wasn't paying attention, or I don't know what to make of it. But Antonio said that afterwards he did go and tell police about what happened, that he spoke to Khalil Tatum, despite police saying that Shamika very clearly stated to them and told them on numerous occasions that Relisha had been with Khalil Tatum or Dr. Tatum. She's also made other claims and stated to numerous sources that Relisha was actually in the care of her Aunt Ashley and her grandmother Melissa. She's even specifically stated that the grandmother was supposed to take Relisha to the hospital, and somehow that never happened. There's a quote on NBCWashington.com where Shamika says, quote, "I wasn't under the impression she was missing. I thought she was at my sister's house." So now we have this possibility that Shamika has said that she knew Relisha was with Dr. Tatum, knowing also that Dr. Tatum was not actually a doctor. We also have her saying that she was with the grandmother and the aunt. Shamika's also very directly stated that she has never told police that Relisha was with Khalil Tatum or a Dr. Tatum. But naturally, the police then went to speak with Ashley, Relisha's aunt, and Melissa, her grandmother. And it seems like they may have been living together just based on the way it was stated, but I am not 100% certain. And I also am not sure exactly what happened during these interviews. However, I do know that Relisha's grandmother has since been very adamant about the fact that she did not have Relisha at the time. She also has made it very clear that she did not hand Relisha over to Khalil Tatum. She also completely denies ever writing or bringing any letters into the Payne Elementary School to try to excuse Relisha's absences at the time. And so now we have this part of the family saying absolutely not, like we had nothing to do with this. We played absolutely no part. Shamika's turned around and said that the grandmother actually played a huge part and was one of the ones sending these letters into the school, which also is somewhat supported by what the social worker has said. So there's just so much going on here, and it's so difficult to try to figure out the truth in it all, or if there's just a big misunderstanding, or what exactly is going on. So now we're going to get to this Dr. Khalil Tatum. Honestly, I feel like this man tricked a lot of people, and that's how all of this even came to be. So Khalil Tatum, his legal name is actually Carl Tatum, from my understanding. He just either took on the name Khalil Tatum while in one of his stints in prison. He may have legally changed it. I'm not 100% sure. But he was 51 years old at the time that he abducted Relisha Rudd. According to pretty much majority of people that were spoken to about Khalil Tatum, people had nothing but good things to say about him. Shamika even stated that she trusted this man with pretty much her life, her children, and he was referred to as the godfather of Relisha Rudd by Shamika. Granted, this kind of came up out of nowhere. Not clear if they knew Khalil Tatum before moving into the shelter. Shamika has stated that he was actually a friend of a family member, so maybe they knew him before, maybe they just met him at the shelter. But what we do know is that he was always around Relisha, and not just in the shelter, but even outside of the shelter. According to Shamika and other family members of Relisha, and even other staff members and residents in DC General, Khalil Tatum would very frequently bring Relisha gifts. He was kind of known for trying to befriend all of the little girls in the entire building, which as a parent, and not just a parent, but someone involved in true crime, is like an immediate red flag, is like massive red flag. But regardless, I guess Shamika trusted this man, and so he would frequently bring Relisha gifts. He bought her a tablet when he wasn't bringing her gifts inside of the shelter, or, you know, taking her to get food. Basically, parents had to be with their children at all times in the shelter, and it seems that sometimes Khalil would kind of take on that role temporarily so that she could go eat when her mom was off doing something or things along those lines. But he would also take her off of DC General property, and he would take her to the mall to get her nails done, take her to go see movies. He also apparently had a granddaughter that was around Relisha's age, and so they would even have sleepovers at this man's house. Residents remember every time Relisha would come back from staying with him, she would have like all these new clothes and fancy, nice sort of things. There were times when Khalil would even pick Relisha up from her relatives' homes, and these relatives did not know him very well. They just knew that Shamika would constantly say, like, this is Relisha's goddaddy, and that's what Relisha called him as well, was goddaddy. So while it definitely seemed like a strange situation, Shamika seemed very sure of the fact that this guy was safe and everything that was going on was entirely normal, so it seems like most people just kind of went along with it. Now, neighbors of Khalil also had pretty much only positive things to say about him and his wife, Andrea. Neighbors said that he and his wife always seemed super happy. They were enjoying life. They had just gone on a trip to the Bahamas. A lot of people said that he also kind of took on this role as being a mentor to all of the young boys in the neighborhood that he lived in. And one neighbor even said that Andrea and Khalil had spoken about retiring, and when they did, they wanted to open up a place for families in need. So it seemed like they just wanted to give back to the community. They wanted to do good, which lines up with this idea that Shamika's like, no, this guy just wants to be helpful. He just wants to give things to Relisha that I can't, you know, like things along those lines. And it seemed like most of the people at the shelter as well didn't really question any of the behavior, but there were definitely some that viewed it as odd and were on high alert. There were a handful of parents at the shelter who, upon hearing that their young child was receiving presents from this 51-year-old janitor, who was not supposed to have any sort of relationship with the residents, period, they very quickly put a stop to that. There are some people in Shamika's life that said that they tried to warn her about this behavior and just tell her to just keep an eye out and make sure there wasn't anything strange going on here. But Khalil had many different charges. None of them seemed to be very violent or anything along those lines. It was like theft, stuff like that. But obviously it was pretty big time theft because it landed him incarcerated from 1993 to 2003, and then again in 2004 until 2011. So he was only a few years out of prison at this point. And because he wasn't working in a position at the shelter that would have had him closely working with children, he didn't have to undergo certain background checks. Now, in this shelter, because it's like government run and all of those things, there are very serious requirements. Like if you are in a position where you're working close with children or you could be a potential safety hazard, you cannot have a criminal record like Khalil had. But again, because he was just supposed to be a janitor, no one was really worried about it. But as you can tell, also, he managed to kind of get around that. There was also a very strict rule about fraternization at this shelter. Employees are not supposed to have any sort of relationship with the residents, but that rule was never followed either. To give you another glimpse into what DC General was like, apparently it was a rule that was never really followed. There are plenty and plenty of rumors out there of specific things that have happened, but to kind of give you a gist, there have been complaints by residents that employees would solicit sexual favors from them in exchange for things like extra blankets for them and their children, money. I mean, pretty much random necessities that they just needed more of, they were taken advantage of. This whole situation just did not sit right, but according to some sources, Shamika said that she didn't want Relisha reported as missing because she was safe. She was with someone that she trusted, Khalil Tatum. I've also seen it stated that she did not want to report Relisha as missing out of fear that her other 3 children would be taken from her. Police, upon hearing all this information and trying to puzzle together information that made absolutely no sense, they decided to go ahead and call Khalil's phone to try to get in contact with him. And a family member of Shamika's also went to his home to try to see if he and Relisha were there, but his phone went straight to voicemail and the house was empty. So Khalil became wanted in connection with the abduction of Relisha Rudd and an investigation began. So the following day of March 20th, 2014, this is when the public was really made aware that there was a missing 8-year-old girl. A press conference was held and this alerted the community to Relisha's disappearance, and also they announced that the FBI was already helping work on the case, likely because they knew so much time had lapsed and they could not get a solid ground to stand on in terms of information about where she was, who was supposed to have her, because there was just a bunch of finger pointing going on. Photos of both Relisha and Tatum were released and they began to try to look for both of them. Members from the Playtime Project ended up with a lot of these flyers and they went to DC General themselves to post them up because obviously these are the people that were closest to both Khalil Tatum and Relisha and her family. But apparently within a few hours of posting all these flyers, they had already been ripped down. And according to interviews with them, they were ripped down by employees that were close to Khalil Tatum. Through questioning done by police at this point, they were able to conclude that Tatum was likely driving a 2007 Chevy Blazer with the Redskins emblem on the back of it, and it wasn't long at all before a tip came in stating that the car was parked out of a Red Roof Inn in Oxon Hill, Maryland, outside of room 132. Now, and according to Google Maps, this Red Roof Inn is about a 10-mile drive away from the shelter. Prince George County Police, who is in charge of Oxon Hill, Maryland, arrived on scene as soon as they possibly could, and they began a search going room to room, searching for Khalil Tatum. And when they finally got to room 132, they stumbled into something that made their hearts sink and I think really drove home the reality of the situation. Khalil Tatum's wife, 51-year-old Andrea Tatum, was found in their room at the hotel deceased from a gunshot wound to her head. So now we don't only have a missing 8-year-old child, but now the man thought to be responsible for this missing 8-year-old child's disappearance and or abduction now has potentially murdered his own wife. So further investigation showed that the couple checked into the hotel room on March 19th at 10:04 p.m. Interestingly, this is the exact same day that the police were finally alerted to Relisha's disappearance. And I know a lot of people said that there's no way he could have known at that point because no one had really released anything. There was no press release, nothing like that. But this man also worked at DC General, and that day police had been all over DC General speaking to Relisha's parents. Word travels fast in a place like that, so I think it's pretty safe to say that he could have been alerted. And then if we go by what Antonio said, he may have even been working that day while all of that was going on. Either way, they checked into this hotel. According to Andrea's daughter, the reasoning Andrea gave for checking into the hotel was because their heat had gone out in the house. This is March in Washington, D.C., very cold, so because she had anemia, they went ahead and checked into a hotel room. And apparently they were not alone. I'm not exactly sure if this came from surveillance footage, someone coming forward, staff, not exactly sure what. But 3 other individuals aside from Khalil and Andrea were in fact there the night when they checked into the hotel. However, Relisha was not in that group of people. 3 individuals then left about an hour and a half later, and at about 5:40 a.m. the next morning, which would be the 20th, the day that it was announced in the press conference that Relisha was a missing person and they were searching for Khalil Tatum, this friend went back to the hotel early that morning to pick Khalil up. I'm unsure if this was something that had already been planned or if Khalil randomly called and asked for a ride, but this person did end up telling authorities that when they got there, Khalil would not let them look into the hotel room. And when they managed to kind of glance past Khalil, they did in fact see Andrea on the bed behind him. And at this point, she had likely already been shot and killed by Khalil Tatum. But this seems to be the last day that Khalil Tatum was also seen. By the following day, it was announced by Prince George County Police that they had issued a warrant for Tatum's arrest in connection to the murder of his wife, Andrea. Police had the chance to speak to those close to the couple to try to figure out what maybe was going on between them, and they realized very quickly that the relationship was not exactly in a great place, like some people had described it, like the neighbors that said, oh, they just went on a vacation, everything was fine and dandy. Apparently, Andrea's daughter said that Andrea had more recently come to her saying that she wanted to get a divorce from Khalil. And according to her, there were domestic issues within the marriage. I'm not sure if that means physically or, some other way, but she was considering leaving him. But further digging pointed out that Khalil was like 10 steps ahead of her. Apparently on February 7th of 2014, just weeks prior, he had gone to the court and he had filed for a legal separation from Andrea. I don't know if she knew about this. I don't know what the details are about it, but clearly there was something going on. In an attempt to locate Tatum or possibly some sort of evidence or information, they obviously took the warrant to his home, and when they arrived, they found a questionable collection of items within the house. There was apparently $87 in cash that was sitting out. I have seen some sources state that there was a, quote, large sum of money sitting out in the open. They very specifically differentiate it from the $87 in cash, so I'm not exactly sure what that could mean. But they also found 5 separate cell phones in the home, 2 passports, children's clothing and shoes, and a picture of Relisha Rudd. That is quite a sketchy combination of things. And I'm going to get deeper into this in a little bit, but there has been a theory that she was sold into trafficking. When you hear about this large source of money, what were the 2 passports for? Like, whose names were they in? Was Relisha in one of them? Like, what was the photo of her doing there on the table? To me, that makes it sound like it's pretty possible trafficking could have been a situation here. The following day, on March 22nd, there was a candlelight vigil held for Relisha, for those that knew her and loved her, and the entire community was devastated. Everyone that was in DC General felt unsafe. These are people that they knew. I mean, at this point, imagine how all of these different parents are feeling knowing that could have been my daughter. Like, what if I had allowed this man to continue giving her gifts? People's minds were probably absolutely all over the place. But unfortunately, it also became another situation where Relisha's family kept pointing the finger at each other. Nobody seemed to want to take responsibility for who was supposed to have Relisha in their care. No one wanted to admit or even be accused of giving Relisha to Khalil Tatum. She just got lost, you guys. She got lost in a total mess. By March 24th, police released even more photos of both Relisha and Khalil Tatum. Thankfully, the Playtime Project had tons of different photos of Relisha and even a video of her, which is absolutely awesome, just to give people an idea of how she moved and how she spoke, just in case what her voice sounded like. And so they were hoping releasing these things would help raise awareness, trigger some memories. And then on the 25th, police released something that they hoped would maybe again trigger some sort of memory in someone. So the FBI ended up releasing a video that day that they had managed to track down. And I want to quickly state that there has been a lot of complaints on how police investigated and how everything was done. But honestly, all I've thought my entire time of looking into this is how in the absolute world did they figure out or track down any of the things that they managed to do, given the lack of information and knowledge that anyone seemed to have about what was going on in the past 2-3 weeks prior to Relisha being reported missing. So just a side note, but the video that they somehow managed to track down was from February 26th. The video shows both Relisha and Khalil Tatum at a Holiday Inn in Washington, D.C. It captures them just casually walking down the hallway and going into one of the hotel rooms. So we know that this is where Relisha was on the 26th. And then on March 1st, they apparently also found out that they had moved from that Holiday Inn to, I believe, a Days Inn just across the street. And this time, March 1st, at this Days Inn, this is the last time that Relisha was ever seen with Tatum again. I don't know if they have video from that Days Inn or if it's just a paper trail or someone put in a tip, but they've not released any footage or anything like that in regards to that particular hotel stay. They also announced at this time that there was a $25,000 reward being offered by the FBI and then an additional $25,000 reward being offered by the Prince George County Police Department. So we know she was alive and well on the 26th. We know she was alive and well on March 1st, at least for some portion of the day, but there's nothing from that point on. Police announced that they had found that Khalil Tatum was living his life as normal from March 2nd until about March 20th to the 21st. He was still going to work. He was still seen around town. He obviously checked into that Red Roof Inn. But in all of that time, Relisha was not seen with him again. And during that time is when he's, telling the school, oh, I'm a doctor and she's in my care. Multiple billboards were utilized all along the East Coast at this point, thanks to the help from the FBI, to try to help raise awareness in case Tatum took Relisha across state lines. Now, there was an issue when it came to the Amber Alert that I was kind of able to figure out, but unfortunately, it's still not an answer that's really very comforting. But there was a huge problem with the Amber Alert. There was one that was sent out in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. stated that they had told other states surrounding them to also send out an Amber Alert because they feared that he was going to take her across state lines. But when the media went and spoke to the different surrounding states like Pennsylvania and Virginia, they are like, we were never told to put out an Amber Alert. There is no Amber Alert here. Now, this was looked into, and apparently these states were reached out to. They were made aware of the Amber Alert that was going on in DC, but it seems there was some sort of miscommunication that made it to where they weren't ever told to put out an Amber Alert of their own in that area. But if I'm being real honest, the last time she had been seen was on March 1st. All of this was being done, from the 20th on. So I'm not really sure how much an Amber Alert would have helped at that point. Regardless, with something like that, that's something that you can't afford to get wrong. And unfortunately, they did, in fact, get it wrong. Also seen that at this point, they extended the search down to Atlanta, Georgia, and they said it was due to a connection Khalil Tatum might have had down there. To me, this kind of indicates that what was on the Charlie Project, that Shamika stated that there was some medical conference down there or some reason that he took Relisha down there. Maybe that's why they went to check down there, or maybe he had relatives down there. I'm not entirely clear on that, but I don't think anything was found. And they also encouraged the public, if they somehow came in contact with Khalil Tatum, to try to convince him to turn himself in for the sake of him and this missing 8-year-old girl. But then another very scary and telling and heartbreaking discovery was made. So during their search around this time of, what happened between the first and the second, Relisha was okay on the first, she was with him, and then nothing. They managed to find that on March 2nd, the day after the last time Relisha was seen, Khalil Tatum went to a local Home Depot and he purchased some very questionable items. First and foremost, and this is the only thing that police specifically have released, is that Khalil Tatum purchased a box of 42-gallon self-tie contractor trash bags the day after he is no longer seen with this 8-year-old missing girl. They have stated, however, that there were other alarming items that he had purchased, but I had not seen it actually released by police. However, multiple resources have come forward and stated that they have found out that he had also purchased lime and a shovel, and it doesn't take an absolute rocket scientist to figure out what all of those items likely mean. After Khalil bought these items at a local Home Depot, they ended up being able to track him to Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens that runs along the Anacostia River. And this is located quite literally like a hop, skip, jump away from the neighborhood that Khalil Tatum grew up in. And it's also downstream from the shelter itself. And because he spent time in this 700-acre park immediately after buying all these suspicious items, police decided to immediately shut down the park, and a search was started on March 27th. Police Chief Kathy Lanier said, quote, "We cannot ignore the possibility that Tatum may have killed her. Given the circumstances right now, we are fearful of leaving any stones unturned." She also announced that at this point, they believed that the search likely had switched to a recovery mission. So as I said, Kenilworth Park is absolutely massive. It's 700 plus acres. It's a lot of land to cover. They shut everything down, so the public was not allowed to be there at all. And over 100 officers participated in the search. They had everything you could possibly imagine, from search dogs. They had multiple search and rescue experts from the FBI and local police agencies. They had helicopters searching from above. They had a number of officers performing incredibly detailed grid searches. Not a single trash can, bush, rock, anything went unsearched. They had dive teams going into the different ponds throughout the park. And after a few days of searching and not finding anything, they decided to bring on volunteers from different foundations like Black and Missing and other trusted search and rescue teams. But that quickly changed on March 31st. Khalil Tatum was found in a building in Kenilworth Park. And he, just like his wife, was deceased from a gunshot wound to the head. And this time, police believed it was self-inflicted. After he was found, everyone was told to leave, the entire search was shut down, and everyone held their breath. Further examination found that the gun that was used in the death of Khalil Tatum was the same exact gun used in the death or murder of Andrea Tatum, his wife. And they also found that this was, in fact, a self-inflicted wound. And at the time that Khalil was found, March 31st, he had likely already been dead for at least 36 hours, if not a few days, which, looking back on the timeline, means it's very possible that he had decided to end his life around the time the video was released of him being seen with Relisha in the hotel. But unfortunately, it seems like once Khalil Tatum was found, everything just kind of hit a standstill. All of the large searches were called off. They definitely still had some, but I don't know. It just seems like they were so desperate to find Khalil and desperate to find those answers. But now the man that they believed to have all the answers was gone and could give them nothing. And so I think everyone just felt super helpless and like they just didn't know where to start anymore. They didn't know where to go. Relisha's face slowly faded from the media, unfortunately, but those that knew Relisha did continue fighting for her and fighting for answers, because how does something like this happen? How did someone that's supposed to be under the watchful eye of multiple different agencies go missing for 18 plus days and nobody even knew? People were angry, understandably, and they felt unsafe. So Mayor Vincent Gray ended up ordering an investigation into the city's response to Relisha's disappearance. And this is the review that I've been mentioning occasionally throughout the entire video. Now, ultimately, on September 2nd of that year, the review was finalized. And to sum it up very briefly, They basically stated that there was nothing more that could have been done to prevent what happened. But here's going into a little bit more detail. So the opening of the review states, quote, "The safety and well-being of any child is ultimately the responsibility of his or her parents or legal guardians and family. At the same time, the government mission and mandate is to intervene when necessary to support families and protect children. The purpose of the review was to assess all of the facts surrounding the district's involvement with this family to determine whether the district's health and human service agencies and DCPS followed internal policies and procedures in providing services to Relisha Rudd and her family, and to make policy and programmatic recommendations if warranted. Even if all of the policy and practice recommendations in this report had been in place and fully implemented, the review team did not find evidence that these tragic events were preventable." So that was their actual conclusion and opening statement into the review. That even if all of the problems they found had in fact been fixed up and dealt with, that nothing could have prevented this. And not a lot of people necessarily agree with that. So I'm going to kind of go over a few of the points that they had mentioned in the review. So it's stated in this review that it was found that multiple agencies were involved with the family from 2013 to 2014. But apparently none of these agencies ever held meetings together to get on the same page. So you've got all of these different entities helping this family out, but they're not sitting down saying, okay, hey, this is our finding. This is how we think we can best support this family. How can we work together and combine all of our efforts to benefit them the most? Because of this lack of communication, they were not able to receive the most help possible. There was just all of this being done to help them, but when you've got so many people on completely different pages, there's only so much that's actually beneficial. To add to this, it was found that the school officials themselves at Payne Elementary had a very, very difficult time getting information necessary to understand the child's needs, Relisha's needs, as well as the family situation. And when you're going to have these homelessness liaisons and, people like that working within the school to try to help these children, make sure they get to school, make sure they eat, make sure everything is taken care of, that they're okay there, that they're okay at home. If these different school officials don't even really know what's going on at home, and they can't even get access to information about what's happening, they also cannot help that child and family as much as humanly possible. So had there been more communication, had they known there were these other things going on, a red flag may have been raised with them sooner. There was also mention of some entity that was very highly redacted. It was like the most redacted thing in the entire review, that basically said that this entity was supposed to be providing services for the family at the time, but that they had not performed a recent assessment of Relisha's parents' quote, capacity or of the family's overall functioning, which I think is absolutely crucial because it plays a huge part in how often Relisha was apparently not even in the care of her parents. And had they found that information, that may have led them to the fact that Relisha was spending a lot of time with Khalil Tatum, someone that she was not supposed to be with, according to policy at the shelter. It goes on to state, quote, "The documents indicate that all 4 children were present in the family shelter for less than 50% of the time that the children resided there with their parents. During the nightly checks, verifying the presence of children, a requirement to reside in the family shelter, TCP did not accurately determine whether the children were present and did not identify children by name. Rather, staff listed only the number of children present." So for over 50% of the time in that year that this family was at the shelter, at least one of the children was not there, was staying with somebody else. Now, I do want to make it very clear, and it states this in the review as well. It's not like that's illegal. These parents are allowed to make other arrangements. And as I stated before, it seemed to be the goal just across the board to make sure these children spent at the least amount of time as possible in the shelter. However, there's also a very important reason why these nightly checks are done and why it was so important to get the exact child that was gone, why they were gone, who they were going to be with. because it could potentially prevent situations like this where these parents don't know where their child is somehow for like 3 weeks. According to what was said, when these checks were done, they didn't even come into the room, didn't have the families open the door. They just knocked on it, said how many kids are in there, wrote it down, and then went on. And had the reports been properly done the way that they are supposed to be, there may have been a much clearer timeline of where Relisha was during all of this. And unfortunately, we just don't have that now. And then the final point that I want to bring up in this review is that in July of 2013, there was an annual inspection done at DC General. And this inspection pointed out all of the issues pretty much for the most part that I mentioned at the start of this video. The fact that there were broken toilets, there were constantly water leaks, there was a huge lack of child safety measures like covers for outlets, things along those lines. They even brought up there that there were medical records, like people's medical records just hanging out in boxes in open rooms. But more shockingly is that when they pulled files from 14 random personnel from the employee database, not a single one of them had gone through proper background checks, which, given their position, should have been required. So DC General had just been called out for not properly doing background checks on individuals that were in these safety sensitive positions. So while this review did state ultimately that even if everything had been fixed and done properly, that this couldn't have been prevented, I'm going to go out on a limb and call BS on that, because that could have made all of the difference. What I just said, just that one thing alone, just the nightly checks and asking where Relisha was, that could have made a difference. I think all of this could have made a difference, but instead Relisha was failed at like every single point along the way. I will say that DC has since taken measures to attempt to prevent things like this from occurring. They ended up totally shutting down DC General. It was too big to manage. They were not putting the proper resources into it to make it an actual safe and family-friendly shelter. Instead, they just decided to shut it down and open up multiple smaller shelters around DC so that it was much more manageable. They could cater it directly to these families or maybe just individuals. They've also ensured that there are playgrounds at every single one of these shelters so that the children have a safe option of a place to play. All of this started a very massive conversation as well about the lack of trust between the community, especially, marginalized members of the community. And the conversation was about how many tips likely don't come in because of this. Several activists in the community decided to take it upon themselves to go out and start conversations like this with these individuals that may not be willing to speak to police, to hand over tips like this, whether it's to protect themselves or out of fear. There's so many different reasons. Try to encourage these open lines of communication so that hopefully cases like Relisha's could be solved a lot faster. This crucial information just really needs to be brought forward. But Frederick Hill III, who is a missing persons advocate in the area, has on top of that said that there's this fear of police, obviously, and retaliation from them or not being believed. There's a whole list that I could get into, but there's also a massive lack of knowledge. He said, quote, "Unless they have been counseled on their rights and how to protect themselves when giving information, it makes it hard for people to come forward." There's just this massive gap here, a massive, massive gap. And I feel like that just encompasses this entire case. We have these families that are struggling, and yes, the parents are supposed to be their caretakers, but these agencies are there to bridge that gap. It seems like that gap was just not being covered properly. And then you have this giant gap and lack of trust between these people in these marginalized communities and that are very vulnerable. With that vulnerability and just their position in life, we have a lack of access to plenty of different things, mental health care and education and all of these things that could help them understand how to protect themselves and how to help the community and all of these different things. There's just so much that can be learned from this case, and it points out so many flaws that we have as a community. When it comes to Relisha, a grand jury ended up investigating the case on obstruction of justice charges, against Shamika because of her multiple inconsistent and changing statements, which, as I had already pointed out, they were all over the board. She was apparently the one who even alerted DCPS to Dr. Tatum, knowing he wasn't a doctor, and, also told this to police, even though she said that she never said that to them. And then we also have her saying, no, but she was at her aunt's house, my sister's house, and her sister and her grandmother were like, no, that's not true at all. So there was obviously this question there enough for them to have this grand jury investigate. But ultimately, I don't think anything ever came of it, and they never actually proceeded with charges. More searches have been done in recent years. The Anacostia River was searched 2 more times. They once searched in 2016, where they focused near the Arboretum, and then again in January of 2018 they searched and they checked the water near the shelter itself. I don't think there have been many active searches after this at all, or I've just not managed to find them. Obviously, there have been multiple theories in this case. And I kind of want to start by speaking about Andrea, Khalil's wife. Now, according to those that knew her best, she had her own struggles. She had a history of her own. She had a history of drug use, amongst other things. But in the decade prior to her death, she had entirely turned her life around. A loved one said, quote, "You couldn't use a dump truck to pull her in the wrong direction." She volunteered at church regularly. She worked for Glorious Men's Health Club, which provided very affordable, low-cost rooms for gay men in the area to have a safe, warm place to stay. She worked for numerous causes that helped to aid the homeless community in the area. She had really done everything she could to help out those around her. Those that knew her have pretty much just echoed the exact same stance, that she never would have played any part in whatever happened to Relisha, that it's likely she knew something. She knew too much. She likely was going to report it because she stood up for what she believed in, and it more than likely led to her death. Her cousin stated in an interview, quote, "Andrea was a beautiful person, and she didn't deserve what she got. He's a wolf walking out here amongst us. He's a demon. She lost her life by standing up for what she believed in." Then there is Gerald Wills, who had known Andrea for over 30 years. I guess all of the times, the 2 10-year stints that he spent in prison, Gerald Wills was the one there, keeping her on her feet, keeping her going, taking care of her as best he could. Everyone referred to him as her second husband. And he said, quote, "He couldn't have loved her because look what he did. I think she found out something. That's why he did it. He thought she was going to tell." Gerald Wills also echoed what Andrea's daughter said, that Andrea had mentioned to him wanting to get a divorce from Khalil, but he also stated that she had been taught in Narcotics Anonymous to make amends with those around her. And while that's a great practice to have, unfortunately, she may have been hanging on to that way too tightly. It just made me really heartbroken because obviously you want so much attention on the fact that there is a missing 8-year-old girl, but at the same time, that was not the only victim here. We have this 51-year-old woman who had a family. She had friends. She was a great person trying to do better in the community, and she was also taken. And I just don't want that to be forgotten amongst everything else. And while it seems pretty dang obvious to not just anyone looking from the outside in, but also to authorities, that Khalil was likely running because he had information and he ended his life to not have to face whatever he had done or whatever he knew, there are still some that are related to him that have said that there's absolutely no way. And if I'm being really honest, that does not come as too much of a surprise to me, because when I initially was hearing what everyone had to say about him and, the way that he was treating everyone and the way that he befriended everyone possible, what he wanted to do after he retired, what his neighbors had to say about him, he doesn't come off as someone that you would expect to be involved in something like this. And even a family member, and I believe it was his nephew, said that when his face showed up on the news, their first thought was, he was the victim. There was never any moment where they're like, oh, he's done something wrong, because that's just not how he really portrayed himself to a lot of people. But unfortunately, sometimes the worst people out there are the best at disguising it. To this day, nobody really knows what exactly happened to Relisha. As I had briefly mentioned before, there have been a lot of people that believe that she was sold into trafficking. There have been a handful of different people, including family members, that people have pointed the finger at, saying that they possibly played a part in it. And family members have pointed the finger at other family members, accusing them of playing a part in some horrible scheme. But according to one of the more recent interviews with investigators, doesn't seem that they have really looked into that very much. They did say that they didn't go down that avenue. It's not something they had looked into. However, I don't know if that's happened in the more recent years. So maybe it's just easy to believe that could be a possibility. Obviously, the police have a lot more. They have a much better picture built. So it seems there may have actually been something else going on there. Maybe this was actually just related to Khalil's desires or fantasies. Relisha was not the only individual that Khalil Tatum tried to get close to. It was every single female, every young girl for the most part that he could get his hands on at this shelter. And that really just doesn't say anything at all that's good. But one thing that I really just have struggled understanding this entire time is why on earth Relisha's mom seemed to continue this lie that Khalil was a doctor. And it could very well be explained away by the fact that she maybe was scared. Maybe she didn't want anyone to question why her daughter wasn't coming to school. Maybe Relisha was actually sick, but she couldn't afford to take her to a doctor. You know, something was going on. We really don't know. But I don't understand. That to me is like this joint effort to create that sort of storyline. And so it just honestly does make me wonder if Shamika knows something more than she is letting on. I know that she's been under a huge spotlight in the media as possibly having information or being involved. The Steve Wilkos show has done their part in pointing that out quite a lot. I don't necessarily love their approach on it at all. She's refused to take a polygraph test on the Steve Wilkos show. I don't think that necessarily means a single thing. But it's just, I understand why there is this speculation. And even Antonio now is like, why? Why won't you take this test? Like, why won't you answer these questions? Because it really doesn't make sense. Like, why? Where did this idea of Khalil Tatum being a doctor come from? There is an answer to it. It's just not being told. It's just hard to figure out if people really did have some sort of idea where Relisha was during all this time, or is the reality that no one really did have any idea what exactly was going on with Relisha, or where she was, or who was watching her, or who she'd been handed to. And so that's why all this finger pointing and chaos began, because all of these individuals were aware that at some point they had not taken proper responsibility of this 8-year-old child, and it led to her disappearance. Just such an upsetting case to me, because I feel like there was so much that could have been done to prevent this. This little girl she was just trying to be a kid, you guys. She was just trying to be 8 years old and live her life to the best of her means in the situation that she was in. If she had been handed off to Khalil, whether it was out of pure trust or, whatever reason it was, it makes me even more heartbroken to know that she probably not once questioned her safety. This man had spent a while grooming her and giving her things and earning her trust and spending time with her. And even her own mother fully, supposedly trusted this man. So knowing that she went into this fully trusting of him and thinking she'd be taken care of, and then something happened to her along the way, it's gonna make me cry. But I freaking have an 8-year-old, and hearing that and imagining that, it's so not right, and something should have and likely could have been done to stop this. I feel like she just walked into a trap that no one had the chance to save her from, because unfortunately she just slipped right under the radar. Khalil Tatum may no longer be here with any answers. she's still out there somewhere. I don't know if she's alive or if she's deceased and had been hidden somewhere, but I just don't want her face to continue to fade from the media. And I know I'm just like one single YouTuber, but it's like to see her failed so many times. I just want to see people do right by her. You know what I mean? Like, I want to see everyone remember her and keep her name out there. There is an updated age progression photo of her that I'll put up here for you guys to see. Please share that as well, because there's absolutely no telling at all if she could have ended up somewhere. I do still honestly believe, despite the fact that it's not been looked into, that she could have ended up being sold into sex trafficking. I'm interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comments below, whether it's ways that we all can help in our own communities to make sure things like this don't happen, different organizations that we can support that help to provide a safe place for these children that are struggling with homelessness and all of these situations that make them more vulnerable. But that is all that I have for you guys today. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to Relisha's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Helen fam, so that hopefully we can bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.